Welcome to World Talk Brief. All right, so here's what we're going to dive into today as we unpack the global state of democracy. We'll kick things off with the big picture trend of democratic decline, and then we'll zoom in on the specific freedoms that are under pressure. After that, we'll look at the tangled web of conflict and geopolitics, the modern information battlefield, and finally, we'll wrap up with some crucial bright spots and complexities in the landscape. So let's just get right to it. The first major takeaway from this year's data, well, it's an uncomfortable one. The world is seeing a clear, measurable, and pretty significant democratic decline. And this really is the headline finding from the V-Dem Institute, and it's a stark one. For the first time in 2 decades, there are now more autocracies in the world than there are democracies. That whole period of democratic expansion we saw after the Cold War, it has officially reversed. So what does this shift actually look like on the ground? Well, a huge part of the story is the rise of what's called the electoral autocracy. Now, this isn't your grandfather's dictatorship. These countries hold elections, sure, but the whole game is rigged from the start. The process isn't fair, basic rights like free speech are squeezed, and the opposition is fighting with one hand tied behind its back. It's like having the costume of democracy, but none of the actual substance. Now, this move toward autocracy isn't just about what happens at the ballot box. It's also about the slow, steady chipping away at our fundamental civil liberties and basic accountability. So how do we even measure something like this? Well, organizations like Freedom House use a really detailed scoring system. Think of it like a report card. They rate countries on 2 main things, political rights and civil liberties. Then, based on that score, a country gets labeled free in green, partly free in yellow, or not free in purple. It's a consistent, data-driven way to see how these rights are holding up, or falling behind across the globe. You know, a major driver of this decline, maybe one of the biggest, is when governments fail to tackle corruption. It just eats away at public trust. And the examples are unfortunately everywhere. In Malawi, serious corruption charges against a top official were just, poof, dropped. In Rwanda, major allegations involving the president's family were never even investigated. And in Nicaragua, it's gotten so bad that corruption has become like an extra tax. Citizens spend about 5% of their income on bribes. When accountability vanishes at the top, trust collapses from the bottom up. And it's not just about money changing hands under the table. One of the most critical pillars of any democracy, a free press, is facing a direct and often violent assault. This is a massive red flag that a country's democratic health is in serious jeopardy. And these dangers are not abstract. They are terrifyingly real. Just look at what happened in Bangladesh in 2023. In June, a journalist named Ghulam Rabbani Nadim was killed, allegedly because of his reporting on a local politician. Just a few months later, 3 other journalists were physically attacked for doing their jobs. When simply reporting the truth becomes a life-threatening job, you know accountability is in deep, deep trouble. Okay, so this brings us to this explosive mix of conflict, coups, and geopolitics. And it's so important to understand that these things don't just happen out of nowhere. They're deeply connected to economic pain and the growing rivalry between the world's major powers. Just think about this number for a second. 3.3 billion people. That's how many people live in countries where the government now spends more money paying off the interest on its debt than it does on either education or health. I mean, that's an absolutely impossible squeeze on public services and puts incredible pressure on these governments. And what happens then? Well, this kind of crushing economic pressure isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It fuels real anger in the streets, and it can easily boil over into social unrest. And in that environment, full of chaos and frustration, it creates the perfect opening for military leaders to step in and say, we'll take it from here. And we've seen this exact scenario play out very clearly. In Kenya, for instance, when the government tried to raise taxes to deal with its debt, deadly protests erupted. And if you look across West and Central Africa, that recent wave of military coups was built right on top of public anger over poverty and corruption, a feeling that elected leaders just weren't delivering. So all this instability at home gets amplified by what's happening on the world stage, specifically the growing rivalry between great powers like the US and China. And this puts other nations, what we often call middle powers, in a really tricky spot. They're influential, but they're not superpowers, and they usually prefer diplomacy over picking a fight. These middle powers are basically taking one of 2 paths. Some are balancing, which is pretty much picking a side. Australia is a great example, clearly aligning with the US through the AUKUS Security Pact. Others are hedging, trying to keep good relationships with both sides to get the best of both worlds. That's a strategy Indonesia has often used. And how these middle powers choose to play their cards is going to shape global politics for a long time. Right, so these big geopolitical rivalries, they aren't just fought with tanks and trade deals anymore. They're also fought on a completely different front, the information battlefield. And what's really at stake here is trust itself. So where is all this bad information coming from? Well, reports showed that people are really worried about two main sources. In places like the United States, there's a huge concern about political leaders who use a strategy of flooding the zone with misleading statements. And in other parts of the world, like Nigeria and Kenya, the problem is prominent online influencers being paid by political parties to push false stories. How we get our news also plays a massive role in all this. This chart shows something really interesting. In a lot of Western nations, people are getting their news videos mainly from third-party platforms like YouTube and X. But in the Nordic countries, way more people go directly to the news organization's own website. Why? Because those broadcasters invested heavily in their own platforms, which gives them so much more control over their content and, crucially, their relationship with their audience. So what's the fix? How do we start rebuilding that trust? Well, the answers are actually pretty simple and straightforward. This quote from someone in the UK just nails it. People want transparency. They want to see the proof, know the source, and understand the perspective of whoever is giving them the information. At the end of the day, it's about showing your work. Okay, so I know the overall trend looks pretty grim, but that is not the entire story. To really get the full picture, we've got to look at some of the bright spots and the complexities that add a lot more nuance. And for a bright spot, you don't have to look any further than the absolutely wild events in Senegal in 2024. The president tried to delay the election, which sparked huge protests. Then, the main opposition leaders were thrown in jail right before the vote. It looked like a textbook case of democracy dying. But then, something amazing happened. The opposition candidate, Faye, was released and swept to a massive victory. It was just a powerful reminder of how resilient democracy can be, even under incredible pressure. But here's the thing. Even when you look at the countries at the very top of the list, the picture isn't always perfect. The world's strongest democracies are wrestling with their own really complicated internal issues. Let's take Norway. It's consistently ranked as one of the most democratic countries on Earth. But there's a catch. Reports raise a real concern. Its media is heavily subsidized by the state. We're talking about 1 out of every 3 media kroner coming from the government. This creates questions about state influence over the press, even in a top-tier democracy. It just goes to show maintaining a healthy democracy is a constant balancing act for everyone. And all of this leaves us with one really critical question to think about. We've seen the pressure from economic hardship, from the battle over information, and from geopolitics. As all of these forces just keep getting stronger, the question for all of us is, what does the resilience of democracy truly depend on as we look to the future? Subscribe to World Talk Brief for more clear, thoughtful explanations. World Talk Brief, news explained without the noise.